It was the final Friday of September 1975, when the small, fog-wrapped town of Millhaven last saw Emily Roan, just 17 years old. Emily was the shining star of the local church choir. A gifted soprano with a hauntingly pure voice that left listeners in tears. That evening, she had stayed late after choir practice to rehearse a solo she was preparing for the town's upcoming harvest festival. The choir director recalled hearing her practicing alone, long after the others had left, her voice echoing through the empty pews of St. Matilda's Church. Then, suddenly, silence. The next morning, her bicycle was discovered upright, leaning against the side of the church wall, as if she'd stopped only momentarily. Her cello case sat nearby on the grass, zipped but strangely damp with dew. Nothing else seemed out of place. Her school satchel was still strapped to the back of the bike. Her jacket was folded neatly on the seat. But Emily herself had vanished, without a scream, without a trace, and with no known enemies or reason to run. The town buzzed with theories. But nothing made sense. When local police began their investigation, they were immediately puzzled. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no witnesses, not even a strange car spotted that night. The church's back door had been left unlocked, something the old priest, Father Merrow, insisted was normal practice for late rehearsals. Her last known words, as remembered by a fellow choir girl, were, "I'm just going to play one more piece. I need to feel the silence around it." The poetic sentence, once dismissed as teenage drama, would later become a chilling echo in the community. Emily's family was shattered. Her mother fell into a deep depression, refusing to speak to the media, while her father, Walter Roan, spent hours wandering the fields and riverbanks nearby, calling her name like she might somehow answer from the wind. Search parties scoured the woods. Bloodhounds were brought in. Helicopters hovered for days. But nothing was ever found. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The cello, untouched in its case, was taken home and placed in the corner of her bedroom, unopened since the day she disappeared. In the weeks that followed, rumors filled the vacuum left by facts. Some whispered that Emily had run away with a secret lover. Others believed she was kidnapped by someone passing through town. A few feared something darker, that the church itself held secrets it was desperate to bury. But without evidence, the town moved on slowly, like a wound that never quite scabbed. Emily's name was etched on a candlelit plaque inside the church choir hall, forever in harmony. But for those who knew her best, it wasn't closure. It was a placeholder. Something about her absence didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like a message waiting to be found. Exactly 7 days after Emily's disappearance, on a rainy October morning, Walter Roan opened his front door to find a plain, unmarked envelope resting on his porch step. No postmark. No handwriting. Just a crisp ivory-white envelope, bone-dry despite the downpour that had soaked the street all night. He stared at it for several minutes before picking it up, a strange weight pulling at his gut. There was no name written on it, no return address. It was as if it had simply appeared. Inside was a single sheet of aged music paper, yellowing, creased at the corners. It bore a short musical composition, handwritten in elegant but slightly shaky script. At the top, in ornate calligraphy, was a haunting title, Her Final Song. The melody itself was strange. Walter, a music teacher by profession, studied the piece with growing unease. It wasn't just eerie in tone, it was incomplete. The notes ended mid-bar, trailing off as if someone had been interrupted while writing it, or deliberately left it unfinished. The handwriting didn't match Emily's that much, he was certain, but something about the note gnawed at him. The first few bars of the melody seemed familiar, almost like something Emily used to hum to herself when she thought no one was listening. It wasn't a published piece, not one he could trace. When he took the sheet to the local police, they shrugged it off. There was no threat, no ransom demand. Just music. Probably a twisted prank, they told him. People get weird around tragedies. But Walter couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Late at night, he would play the melody on the piano, over and over, trying to feel what Emily might have felt. Sometimes, he thought he heard her voice between the notes, just a whisper, like an echo caught in the keys. He began isolating the notes, studying them like a code. Was there something hidden in the melody? Was it a message, a cry for help, or a warning? The further he fell into this obsession, the more distant he grew from those around him. His home slowly transformed into a shrine of theories. Strings of red thread crisscrossed over maps, newspaper clippings, and old choir programs. He pinned the sheet music at the center, encased in a clear folder on his wall. Everyone told him to move on, that it was time to let go. But he couldn't, not when someone had gone to the trouble of delivering a secret note to his doorstep. Not when the melody felt like it came from Emily herself. Not when every night, the same question repeated in his mind, like a metronome. Who sent her final song? And why? After the letter arrived, and the trail again went cold, the town of Millhaven slowly settled back into its routines, but not Walter Roan. While others learned to live around the absence of Emily, Walter couldn't. His world had stopped. On the night she vanished, what once was a home full of music and laughter had turned into a mausoleum of silence. Her untouched room remained just as she left it, her hairbrush still holding a few strands. A bookmark mid-page in her worn novel, the curtains still tied with the ribbons she loved, dust collected, but Walter refused to clean, as though any disturbance might erase the faint trace she'd left behind. Walter stopped teaching music that winter. Parents whispered about how his lessons had turned strange, how he would stare at the keys of the piano for minutes at a time, playing nothing, just listening. Eventually, the school asked him to take a leave of absence. He retreated entirely into the shadows of his house, and most days could be seen at his front window, staring out toward the church down the street, where Emily's voice had once risen above all others. That cello, still resting in its case, remained untouched, sealed like a coffin. He wouldn't dare open it. Not yet. He began cataloging everything Emily had ever sung, performed, or written. Her journals, old sheet music, rehearsal tapes, all were carefully archived in a locked cabinet he built himself. But it didn't stop there. Walter started recording ambient sounds from around the house, then playing them back late at night to see if anything was out of place. Every creak, every floorboard sigh became suspect. He was convinced that there were messages, clues, hidden in ordinary things. You just have to know how to hear, he wrote in a notebook. Emily always knew how to hear silence. I must learn to. Soon, he became obsessed with the mysterious composition from the envelope. Her final song. He'd play the strange, unfinished melody repeatedly, altering its tempo, reversing it on tape, transposing it into different keys. At one point, he even consulted a cryptographer in a nearby city, asking if music could be used to hide words. Patterns can contain anything, the man told him. That simple phrase sent Walter spiraling deeper. He began seeing codes in everything: grocery receipts, choir programs, the pattern of birds on power lines. He was no longer searching for Emily, he was decoding a language only he believed existed. Neighbors began to avoid him. And old friends stopped calling. Some believed grief had simply broken him. Others were less charitable, suggesting he'd gone mad. But Walter didn't care. He no longer trusted anyone, not the police, not the church, not even his own memories. Somewhere, deep inside, he was certain Emily had left him a trail, however twisted, to follow. He just needed time. What no one could understand was that for Walter, the silence in the house wasn't emptiness, it was alive. And he was listening. By 1990, it had been 15 years since Emily disappeared. Walter Roan was no longer the man anyone in Millhaven remembered. He was a shadow of himself, older than his age, his face carved with sleepless years and sorrow that clung like fog. Most believed he had surrendered to delusion long ago, but Walter hadn't given up. He simply waited. Waited for the universe to blink. For the silence to speak back. He believed, with a conviction that unnerved everyone around him, that something or someone would eventually break. And on the night of September 28, exactly 15 years to the day Emily vanished. It did. The call came just after 2 a.m. Walter was in his study, half asleep in an armchair. The soft whir of an old reel-to-reel tape, looping through recordings of her final song playing in the background. The phone's sudden ring sliced through the quiet like a razor. He picked it up without thinking, expecting static, as he had received on several occasions from prank callers. But this time, there was no static. Just breathing. A low, steady breath. And then a voice, calm/measured, genderless. The kind of voice you can't place, but never forget. It said only 3 words. Open the cello. Then the line went dead. Walter froze. The receiver stayed at his ear for nearly a full minute as the dial tone hummed endlessly. He dialed *69, desperate to trace the number, but the operator told him there had been no record of any incoming call. Number. No connection. It was as if the call never happened. But Walter knew it had. He could still feel the voice crawling under his skin, like a hand pressing on his shoulder from behind. He stood in the center of the room, his eyes drawn to the dark hallway, and at the end of it, Emily's door, barely ajar. The cello case still sat where it always had, cloaked in shadow. Walter didn't sleep that night. He paced until dawn, whispering the words over and over. Open the cello. It wasn't the first time he'd considered it, but he'd always resisted. To him, the cello was sacred, a piece of Emily untouched by the world since the day she disappeared. Cracking it open felt like desecrating a grave, but the message had come after all these years, and at that exact hour, as if someone had been waiting for the right moment. Someone who knew. Someone who had been watching him. The thought filled him with something far worse than fear. Hope. He spent the next day examining the cello from top to bottom. It was an old German model, spruce top, maple back, and sealed with such precision it had no visible screws or cracks. It wasn't just a student instrument, it had been built with care, possibly even modified. He gently tapped the body, listening for hollow spots, feeling for seams. And then he found something odd, a slight difference in tone near the bass of the instrument, almost imperceptibly. He set it down and stared. 15 years of grief, obsession, and silence now focused on this one impossible question. What was inside? And why had someone waited so long to say anything? The next evening, with the blinds drawn and the house cloaked in silence, Walter placed Emily's cello on the dining room table, the very table where she once did homework, where birthday candles had flickered, where her mother once smiled across steaming cups of tea. Now it was an altar. He ran his fingers across the polished wood, every ridge and curve as familiar to him as his daughter's handwriting. He didn't want to destroy it, this last untouched relic of her life. But the message had come. And after all these years, he was no longer willing to protect a secret he didn't understand. He tried every non-destructive method first. Gentle prying at the seams with a palette knife. Careful warming of the glue joints using a heat lamp. But the instrument held fast, as if determined to keep its secrets. He paused often, trembling with hesitation, his breath catching whenever the wood groaned under pressure. At one point, he nearly stopped entirely, overwhelmed with guilt until he remembered the voice. Opened the cello. That voice hadn't been a memory. It hadn't been imagined. Something was inside, and it had waited 15 years to be found. Finally, his hands shaking, Walter brought out the hammer and chisel from the garage. He placed the cello belly side up and drew in a slow, mournful breath. He whispered an apology, not just to Emily, but to the cello itself, as if it were alive. Then, with one sharp, deliberate motion, he struck near the lower bout. The wood cracked, not violently, but with a deep, splintering moan that echoed through the room like a distant scream. Another blow, and the body split open slightly, just enough to see the hollow chamber within. Dust, silence, darkness, and then something different. Nestled just inside the ribbing, half concealed by a strip of old cloth, was a small, squashed envelope, weathered, brittle, sealed with red wax. Walter reached in with tweezers, heart pounding, and lifted it into the light. It had no name, only a single word, handwritten on the front. Listen. His fingers trembled as he set it aside, too afraid to open it yet. He wasn't done. Inside the cello, deeper near the neck joint, something else was wedged in tightly, a round black canister. An old film reel, no larger than the palm of his hand. Walter sat back in his chair, drenched in sweat despite the cold air. It wasn't just the shock of discovery, it was the realization that someone had hidden this with intention. Carefully, precisely, not thrown in, but stored like a message in a bottle, sealed and left for one person to find. Why a cello? Why Emily's? Why him? He didn't know yet. All he knew was that the silence he had been listening to for 15 years had finally spoken. And now it was time to find out what it had to say. Walter didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The envelope marked "Listen" sat on his desk, unopened, beside the dusted-off reel canister. He had to drive 3 towns over the next morning just to find someone who still owned an old 8mm projector. A retired news cameraman named Lowell let him use it in his cluttered garage. The man chuckled when Walter asked if it still worked. "She's slow," he said, "but she speaks." Walter threaded the reel with shaking hands, carefully, locking it into place, his breath tight in his chest. He hadn't even opened the envelope yet. Whatever was on this film, he wanted to see it raw, unfiltered the way it was meant to be seen. As the projector sputtered to life, the garage darkened, the single beam of light flickering against the far wall. The footage was grainy and jumpy, at first, but soon focused on a dimly lit room. The camera was still, positioned in front of a wooden chair. Sitting in that chair, illuminated by a single overhead bulb, was Emily, pale, quiet, older than when she vanished, but unmistakably her. Her long dark hair was braided down her shoulder. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just sang, softly, a slow, mournful tune. The same one Walter had obsessed over 4 years, her final song. Then a voice, calm, instructive, just off camera, male, familiar, yet distorted through the old audio. Again, the voice said, "Sing it again." Emily nodded and began once more. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the lens. Her voice cracked slightly the second time, and the camera jolted as if someone had gotten angry. There was a long pause. Silence. Emily whispered something then, barely audible under the mechanical hum. Walter leaned in closer. "Daddy," she said, "I know you'll find this." The screen went black. Walter sat frozen. He hadn't realized he was gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles ached. Lowell said nothing, just quietly left the garage, giving him space. When the projector clicked to a stop, Walter opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and water-stained, with edges worn soft by time. It was a confession, dated October 1975. Written in the same handwriting that had composed the strange music sheet years ago. The signature at the bottom made Walter's hands go numb. Father Merrow. The words were sickening. The confession detailed how Merrow had become obsessed with Emily's voice, describing it as angelic, divine, and, disturbingly, mine. He spoke of a moment when she threatened to speak out about inappropriate conversations. About behavior she didn't understand but knew was wrong. He admitted to panicking, to locking her away, to recording her songs to preserve the purity of her gift. The writing wasn't just a confession, it was a justification, a twisted delusion wrapped in music and madness. But what the letter didn't reveal, not yet, was what had happened after the recordings stopped. Or where Emily had truly been taken. The confession shook Walter to his core, but it wasn't enough. It spoke of obsession, of guilt, of madness, but it lacked the one thing he needed most: a location. A final answer. Where had Merrow hidden Emily? The man had died in a car crash 2 years after the letter was supposedly written, a foggy evening on Highway 12, alone, swerving into a ditch at high speed. Police at the time had called it an accident, but Walter now saw it differently. What if it wasn't an accident at all? What if Merrow, knowing the truth might one day surface, had made sure he wouldn't be there to face it? Walter returned to St. Matilda's Church for the first time in nearly a decade. The building had changed very little. The pews were older, the altar dustier, but the bones of the place remained. The choir loft, where Emily once sang with angelic clarity, still overlooked the sanctuary like a forgotten balcony. As he stepped into the shadows of the loft, a strange chill swept over him. He stood in silence, letting the atmosphere settle, listening, the way he used to when Emily practiced alone. That's when he noticed it. Beneath the choir risers, hidden behind a panel of aging wood, was a small, rusted vent. He got on his knees and pressed his ear to it. Silence. Then the faintest sound, like wind moving through a pipe. But it wasn't wind, it was lower, duller, hollow. As if space existed behind the wall. His heart pounded. For hours, he searched the perimeter, gently tapping at the floorboards and the wooden panels along the choir loft's edge. Eventually, he found what he had only ever dreamed might exist: a seam in the floor that didn't match the others. A trapdoor, warped and nailed shut beneath years of renovation. It took a crowbar and raw desperation to pry it open. The air that escaped was thick, musty, and bitter with age. Beneath the floor, dimly visible by the flashlight clutched in Walter's hand, was a narrow stone staircase, spiraling downward into complete darkness. It wasn't on any blueprint of the church. No priest, no official, had ever mentioned such a place. As he descended, each step echoed like a pulse. The walls closed in, damp and cold, and then, at the base, a door steel, rusted, and sealed with a heavy bar across it. Carved into the door, scratched crudely with some kind of nail or key, was one word: listen. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for the bar. He paused, staring at the word carved by someone desperate to be heard. There was no turning back now. Behind that door lay the answers no one had wanted him to find. Answers the town had buried, the church had ignored, and time had tried to erase. Whatever lay beyond that threshold was the final chapter of a story that had haunted him for 15 years. But even in that moment, one terrifying question clung to him. Like a shadow, was he about to find the truth? Or something far worse? Walter slid the steel bar aside and pulled the heavy door open with all the strength his aging arms could muster. The hinges groaned like something in pain. A wave of cold, stale air spilled out, thick with the scent of damp stone and something harder to name, something that smelled like time itself. His flashlight flickered briefly before stabilizing, casting a narrow beam into the chamber beyond. The room was small, windowless, and lined with soundproofing foam, cracked, sagging, but unmistakable. In the center stood a wooden stool, and beside it, an open cello case empty. On the far wall, a second film projector rested on a rusted table, its reel burned and broken. There were papers scattered across the floor, song lyrics, musical notations, and drawings that could only have been Emily's. But what froze Walter completely was the far corner of the room. There, laid gently beneath a dusty choir robe, was a shallow grave hand dug, stones lining the edges with care. Resting above it, like a final offering, was Emily's silver cross pendant, the one she wore every day since she was 12. The authorities recovered her remains days later, confirming the horrible truth. Emily Roan had never left Millhaven. She had died just beneath the place where she had once made people cry with her voice. Merrow had hidden her in silence, a silence so complete, so calculated, that no one had thought to question the very floor beneath their feet. Walter wept, not from relief, but from rage. Rage at the system that had failed her, at the people who had doubted her, and at himself for not opening the cello sooner. In the end, Emily's story didn't end with a miracle. It ended with a song, one buried in wood, tape, and grief. But her voice was heard. The cello was donated to a memorial installation at the church, now sealed in glass. Beneath it reads a single plaque carved in gold. Her final song was found, and sometimes, late at night, townsfolk say they still hear a faint melody drifting from the church, a girl's voice, echoing from below, not trapped, but finally free.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.